Thank you. Hello and welcome to this fireside chat of the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution. My name is Sanjay Patnaik. I'm the director of the center. In our series of fireside chats, we explore important topics related to modern day markets and regulations in one-on-one conversations with business executives, regulators, and academics. Today, it is a real pleasure to welcome Tom Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, from 2013 to 2017. Mr. Wheeler is currently a visiting fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and he is an accomplished businessman and author. For over 4 decades, Mr. Wheeler has been involved with new telecommunications networks and services, and at the FCC, he led efforts that resulted in the adoption of net neutrality, privacy protections for consumers, and increased cybersecurity, among others. As an entrepreneur, he started multiple companies offering innovative cable, wireless, and video communication services. Before being a chairman at the FCC, he was a managing director at Core Capital Partners, and he's also the CEO of Shiloh Group, a strategy development and private investment company specializing in telecommunications services. Mr. Wheeler also served on President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board before becoming the FCC chairman, and both Presidents Clinton and Bush appointed him as a trustee of the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. He is also the former chairman and president of the National Archives Foundation and a former board member of PBS. He's a proud graduate of the Ohio State University, and he has an honorary doctorate from Rochester Institute of Technology. Tom, thank you so much for being here today. It is a real pleasure to have you.
Sanjay, you're great to invite me, and congratulations, you got it right. It is the Ohio State University.
I'm glad I got that right. So I thought we can start off with a rather easy question for our audience. If you can maybe briefly talk about what the role of the FCC is as a regulatory authority and the areas it regulates, and then specifically when you were the FCC chairman, what were some of the most important regulatory areas and challenges that you worked on?
Well, Sanjay, the FCC regulates 1/6 of the American economy, which is an amazing number when you stop and think about it. But it becomes even more amazing because the other 5/6 all rely on it.
That's interesting.
Because the networks over which the FCC has responsibility are the networks that drive commerce and culture in our country. And that's what makes the job fascinating. You combine that kind of scope with the rapid pace of technological evolution, with the changes happening in the marketplace, and it becomes like that line in Through the Looking Glass where the Queen says, now here, the Queen said, it takes all you can do to stay, all the running you can do to stay in the same place. Because it's just constantly, how do you take a statute that was written in 1934 when television didn't exist and updated in 1996 when the internet was AOL and screeching dial-up modems, and how do you make that relevant to the policy challenges, the protection of the public interest, and competition that exist today? And so you say, so what do you think your big accomplishments are? I mean, you listed them before. I mean, net neutrality is an idea that goes back to English common law and the duty to deal. Cybersecurity, you referenced my involvement with the President's Intelligence Board. Cyber attacks come over the networks that the FCC has responsibility for. What are we doing about that? The privacy issue, while everybody else, no federal agencies had stepped up and done anything, or Congress stepped up and done anything about privacy. We passed privacy rules that were really simple, that basically said, the rights that you have as a telephone subscriber, you also ought to have on the internet. And unfortunately, 57 days after the Trump administration took over, the Congress passed a law, and Trump signed it, repealing those protections. So we don't even have the most basic privacy protections when you're on the network today. But the other thing that I would point to that I'm proud of is what we did to connect America's schools. When we came into office, about a third of all the schools in America had high-speed broadband connections, and only about half of those had those connections going to the student's desk with Wi-Fi. When we left, over 95% of all the schools in America had Wi-Fi going to high-speed data going to every student's desk.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a huge difference. Great, thank you. And so here at the center, when we talk about regulations and markets, right, we always think about what is the role of regulations. And so traditionally in the public interest theory, regulations are here to correct market failures or to prevent them. And so when you were chairman at the FCC, can you maybe talk a little bit about what some of the biggest market failures there were that you saw and that the FCC tried to address?
Lack of competition.
Huh, interesting. Okay.
Period. Everything
Well, that's
is
a big one, right? Yeah.
So it was interesting. During my confirmation hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee, one of the senators asked me, "What's your philosophy?" I said, "It's 3 words, Senator: competition, competition, competition." And it became a joke around the commission. I said it so many times, people say it's competition, competition, competition. But the reality is that you go back to all of the things that the FCC has historically done, whether it is broadcasting in the early days of radio or television, very limited number of outlets, lack of competition. Telephone per se, lack of competition.
Yeah, of course.
Internet delivery, again, per se. So when we were doing the open internet order, I think it was 2/3 of the households in America had either 1 or 0 choices to get internet access. Lack of competition. And when you boil everything down, that becomes the driving force. What do you do to encourage competition? And what do you do in the absence of competition to substitute behaviors that normally competition would engender?
That's really interesting that you bring up competition. So how was the division of jurisdiction then between the FCC and the FTC in that regard? When you look at internet access, internet companies, did you guys cooperate? Which part was regulated by the FCC? Which part by the FTC?
So when I was there, the FTC had no authority over common carriers and broadcasting by statute.
So it was all at the FCC. Okay.
What we did do, we worked closely with the Department of Justice and the Antitrust Division. So when Sprint and T-Mobile came in 2014, I guess, indicating they were thinking about merging, and we shook our head and said, that's not a good idea to go from 4 to 3. And the Justice Department did the same thing. We worked very closely on that. When we refused to approve the acquisition of Time Warner Cable by Comcast, we worked very closely with the Justice Department on that. And it's interesting that there are, everybody, and this is relevant to the discussion today about, is antitrust the solution to the big tech problems? Yeah. Okay. So the Justice Department's antitrust authority is derivative from the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, and you have to be able to prove in court specific abuses that will result from the anti-competitive abuses that will result.
Okay, interesting.
The FCC's responsibility is not that.
Okay.
The FCC's responsibility comes into play with the transfer of the licenses to use the public's airwaves. And
okay.
the test for that is it in the public interest, convenience, and necessity?
Mm-hmm.
So which is an entirely different kind of a test. So just like so antitrust and regulatory authority work like this, because antitrust can only go so far, but regulatory authority can talk about specific behaviors and things like this.
And can go a step further, maybe, right? Because it is a different standard. Oh, that's really interesting. And so then if we look at regulations, right, there's also a flip side that sometimes regulations have the potential to impede innovation if they create new market distortions, for instance. So how can regulators strike that balance between correcting a market failure and not over-regulating? And how did you approach that at FCC?
Well, I think that is a reality that exists. That is something that exists more in theory than in reality. I used to constantly hear, "Oh, it's permissionless innovation that is the secret to what we've been able to do." Yeah. Okay, got it. You said in the introduction, I started a whole bunch of companies.
Right.
I was a venture capitalist investing. I believe in permissionless innovation. I don't see any place where we ever said to anybody, you have to come to the FCC to get permission to do that.
Huh. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what we have what has happened is that the digital companies, particularly the dominant digital companies, have made their own rules for how things work. And the question, and that's, it should be that way. It's always been that way. In the industrial era, the industrialists made the rules until their practices encroached on the public interest and the rights of individuals. Okay. And then the government stepped in and had consumer protection, competition protection, worker protection, something which I believe ended up also being industrial capitalism protection, because it protected capitalism from its inherent excesses. Yeah. And that's where we exist today. We need a basic set of rules, and they don't exist today. And so what we were trying to do with the FCC is go at them, unfortunately, in a piecemeal manner, because that's where the statute led us.
But you look basically at these new markets and industries and then see how you can regulate it as these markets develop and as they need these frameworks and the rules to operate on, right?
Yeah, but it's I think you want to look at marketplace behaviors.
Okay.
And say, how do we respond to that behavior rather than the old way of doing things, which was we're going to micromanage how you operate your company.
That's interesting.
Which would and did require permission, but not anymore.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. And then so one question that always relates to regulation and markets, and that is also related to my own work, is that there is a major vulnerability of regulators, that there is a potential for regulatory capture, right? That the regulators and the companies are too close. And so we've seen examples in the past how that can be quite detrimental for the outcomes for both sides, the market and the regulatory side. So how did the FCC under your leadership make sure that it was not unduly influenced by regulated companies?
Well, first of all, you're in a conundrum, because it's the companies that have the facts that you need to know to make a decision. So you need to get that information. So you have to have an ongoing relationship with the companies. There was when President Obama first announced that he was going to nominate me, there was a big outcry of people, because my previous experience had been in industry. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I'd run the National Cable Television Association. I'd run the Cellular Industry Association. I'd been a lobbyist at the FCC and in Congress. They thought, oh, he's going to be in the pocket of the industry. I was asked again. I talked before about my my confirmation hearing. I was asked by Senator Dan Coates, who went on to be Director of National Intelligence in this administration. He specifically confronted me on this, and he said, "So how are you going to deal with this?"
Yeah.
And I said, Senator, you got to understand that when I was an advocate for the wireless industry or the cable industry, I hope that I was the best possible advocate they could have had. But my employers now are going to be the people of the United States, and I want to be the best possible advocate for them and the public interest. And we need to have that kind of attitude. I mean, it is very disappointing that we haven't seen that kind of attitude in the Trump FCC. But I think that starts at the top.
So it really is like you're saying it's an issue of personal leadership and personal values rather than some formal rules maybe that would prohibit from companies from capturing the regulator.
Yeah, and it is also a reflection on the leader who put you there. You know, we're about to see a situation where President-elect Biden is going to have to make decisions about who's going to head the FTC, who's going to head the FCC, and a bunch of other.
So it sets the tone from the top.
Personnel is policy, and you need to make sure that you are putting in there a person who is going to avoid the capture. And I know that Barack Obama's message was avoid capture. I believe Joe Biden's will be the same. Clearly, that was not the practice of the Trump administration.
So that's actually, I mean, I think that's something that might even be looked into in the future, right? If there are maybe some formal rules that can be instituted that could make it a bit more independent of whoever is in charge or whoever is currently in the administration. That's actually quite interesting. So maybe we can change pace a little bit and move to some of your more recent work. So you've recently published a new paper where you discuss how the current regulatory systems are not really sufficient to inform the digital and marketplace area. And I think we have seen that a lot, that to some degree, the markets are moving ahead of the regulators, right? And the innovation. And so you propose a new digital platform agency that is built around the concept of risk management. And so I'd love to kind of like hear from you a little bit about your ideas. So maybe you can summarize the structure of this agency, how it would work, what its mandate would be, and who it would regulate.
Well, thank you for asking that question. The agency would be an independent agency like the FCC or the FTC. It would have a mandate to promote competition and consumer rights in markets, in digital markets, and with the dominant digital companies. Okay. We don't, this is not, you know, we're gonna turn around and worry about, you know, two guys and a dog in a garage.
Yeah.
That's not, you know,
right.
I also love it. It's wonderful because one of the defenses that the big companies use against this is, oh, this will be terrible on the little companies. And, you know, it's just wonderful to see their heartfelt support for the little guys.
For the competitors, right?
Right. And so we've said, no, we're talking about the dominant companies. And then we think that what we have to do is and I should say right now that I was one of the authors of this paper, along with Phil Verveer, who is a legend in antitrust law, and in fact was the guy who signed the complaint at the Justice Department that ended up breaking up AT&T.
Oh, wow.
And Gene Kimmelman, who's another antitrust and consumer protection pro who had until recently been the head of Public Knowledge, which is an incredibly effective public interest group. And it was the three of us together who sat down and said, look, we've been around this town for a long time. We've lived on all sides of these issues as regulators and as advocates. How do we make this work? And so we had two key concepts. First concept is that we need to look at risk management rather than micromanagement. As I said before, let me back up. Our regulatory agencies, the model for regulatory agencies, were created in the late 19th and early 20th century to oversee industrial corporations and their activities. And they imported the management techniques from those corporations because that was how you did management in those days, right? What was corporate management? Corporate management was a guy on the floor, and he was a guy on the floor who followed a set of rules, who was overseen by a supervisor who checked to make sure that he was following the rules, who was overseen by a manager who checked to see that all of them were following rules. And we're surprised that we end up with a rules-based bureaucracy. That's the way companies were run. That was the way everybody thought about managing. And the way in which you manage in that kind of a structure is micromanagement. You're going to put that bolt on with 3 twists, and then you'll be inspected all the way up. And so the regulatory model became this kind of micromanagement, sometimes referred to as utility regulation, where the government participated in virtually every decision the company made.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
And that doesn't work these days. That will inhibit innovation. So first you've got to say, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at the risks and the effects of actions in the marketplace and say, how do I deal with that? Rather than how do I get into the company and tell them that they're going to do this, 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 and this. So the first is risk management instead of micromanagement. The second key component then is we've got to come up with a new regulatory paradigm. We got to come up with a new structure. And because one of the problems with 19th century regulation is that it's slow and arduous, and we got to have, this is we're now in a nimble economy. How do we have regulatory agility to oversee companies that are themselves agile? And so what we discovered is that the companies themselves, since again the 19th century, that have been using codes and standards, the building codes and fire codes, where the industry works out how things should behave, and then the government enforces it. And we said, okay, there's a great structure that works, except for the fact that we want the government to be at the table as they're making that decision, so we don't get handed some kind of an empty bag and say, oh, this is real progress. So we said, okay, this new agency needs to be able to say, we want a standard on this topic X. We are going to oversee as the industry develops a standard on topic X.
Okay.
We are going to decide whether or not that standard is adequate, including public review of that standard. And then we are going to enforce it. And if you don't stick with that standard, it is typical kinds of enforcement penalties. And that provides more agility, more flexibility to make sure that there are rules in place, but there are rules that by design, are able to evolve as the market and technology itself evolve.
Actually, I think this is a really interesting point, because if you look at a lot of regulations, and my own was in climate change, where it is a bit similar, a lot of the regulations are not flexible enough. And I think this is a really interesting point that you highlight, that there has to be this dynamic component nowadays, right? That it has to, these regulators have to be able to adjust it relatively quickly, or to adjust to different market conditions. So this is very interesting. And so speaking of, actually, if we look at the American regulatory sphere, right? And we have seen some recent initiatives in that regard, but I think in general, one could say that the political and regulatory sphere has been quite complacent or quite slow to regulate big tech companies and address a lack of competition in the digital market. Why do you think that is?
Complacent, slow. How about absent?
True. I wanted to be a bit more charitable than that.
So look, the move fast and break things. Mark Zuckerberg's great motto that became the mantra of Silicon
Right.
Valley. Really? The practical effect has been move fast and make your own rules. Okay. And that's because only the companies saw what the future looked like, which they should.
Right.
That's what, that's why they're innovators and leaders. And like the population that they represent, policymakers, didn't get it. Okay. I mean, I was with a brand name member of the Senate a short while ago, and we were an hour into a conversation. He turns to me and he says, "Now tell me again, what's an API?" And I don't blame him, because you go out on the street and you ask a half a dozen people, "Tell me what an API is," and nobody understands it. So policymakers needed to come up to speed. And the companies took advantage of the fact that policymakers weren't up to speed, the fact that things were moving so fast, and they spun this story that there was some kind of digital magic occurring, and if you regulate it, then you're going to break the magic. I mean, the number of times that I sat before congressional committees with members of Congress shaking their fingers at me and saying, "Don't regulate the internet and break the magic."
That's really interesting.
And now I think everybody understands that there have been consequences. That what we've been living through is companies acting in their own self-interest, and nobody's against people acting in their own self-interest.
That's how the market works, right?
Right. But who have been free of the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's time that somebody step up and say, "Hey, there are consequences, there are responsibilities, and here are guardrails." Even Adam Smith, the father of the invisible hand, right? Said that you needed to have a basic set of rules for the invisible hand to work.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole point of regulation. And I apologize. I think my little toddler had just walked in. I guess this is the same.
It was good to see
moment
him. It was good to see him.
He's too low. Anyway, so yeah, I agree. I think this is, when I hear people saying it's a self-regulation works or the invisible hand, it does not work. We know that because you have these market failures, right? And then you need the regulator to step in. And I think, as you said correctly, we see that realization happening in the tech sector now. I wanted to also drill down a little bit on the point that you mentioned about that risk management aspect, which I think is really interesting. Can you kind of like try to talk a bit more deeply about your ideas in that context, and how to balance that like micromanagement that you had mentioned before with the risk management side, and how regulators could kind of like find that balance, and how they can kind of like prioritize different areas when they try to assess risk?
So some of these ideas we actually tried to implement at the FCC when I was there. So let me give you a specific example of risk management. In the open internet rule, we had what we called the general conduct standard, which was that unfair or deceptive acts or practices are outlawed under the statute.
Okay.
And what we needed to have was the ability to look at practices and determine whether they were in fact unjust and unfair.
Yeah.
And that required judgment, that required flexibility, that was not micromanagement. Okay. And the companies didn't like it at all. Yeah. Because they said it was, quote, regulatory uncertainty. The other side of the equation was they didn't like strong rules either, because that was burdensome and restricting. So on one side, rigidity is not good, and on the other side, flexibility is not good. And what that really means is I don't want anything at all.
Yeah, just a different way to reject any regulation, right?
But so we gave ourselves the ability to look at specific instances, have investigations into those specific instances, and to make policy judgments based on those specific instances. And that's so you determine what the risk is, determine what the effect is, and then determine what the best way of dealing with it. And dealing with this may be different from dealing with this.
Oh, that's interesting. And so I think you mentioned also in your paper kind of like that this approach, that there's some precedent for it in history. Can you talk a little bit about what?
Well, I think the point that we made in the paper about the precedent of new regulation for new platforms. I mean, when the railroad came along, you got the ICC. When broadcasting came along, you got the FCC. When nuclear power came along, you got Nuclear Regulatory Commission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a history of the federal government stepping in to oversee new technologies, new platforms, new activities.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so another angle to this is that when we look internationally around, I think when we look at Europe, for instance, we see that they have been a bit more aggressive in tech regulation, and I think really at the forefront. And so what are some of the lessons that you think we can learn from the Europeans and their approach in regulating big tech?
Well, lesson number one is that in an interconnected world, if you're not making the rules, somebody else is.
True that. Yeah.
For you.
Yeah.
Okay. So 2 weeks after we passed the open internet rule, I was in London meeting with all of my counterparts in the EU, all the folks who were responsible for their head of their agencies, to help them write their net neutrality rules so that we would all be in sync. Wow. That's the role the United States used to always play.
Right. Yeah. But not for a long time, I think. Right. I mean, in many areas.
But we have. But one of the consequences of not having a policy is that we have left a void where others can then step in and make the rules, and might have different priorities and different interests in making those rules. But but GDPR, for instance, is pretty much the rule in the United States, even though we've never made that decision, right?
Huh, interesting. Yeah, because I mean the firms have to adhere to it, right?
Because you have to, and so and this has this is not just about consumer protection or competition protection. This has real impact on American companies, and at some point in time, I think they're going to begin to realize that the absence of rules in the United States actually ends up hurting them. Okay, I mean, there's a great quote that Oscar Wilde has in Lady Windermere's Fan, where he says, there are two great tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting it. Okay? The
That's
tech
interesting.
companies got what they wanted, which is government do nothing.
Right.
Nature abhors a vacuum. And now we see foreign governments stepping in, and we see state governments.
Right. California,
stepping
right?
in.
They're also trying to step in. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's a very interesting point, and you see the same in climate policy, right? Because if the US doesn't do anything at the federal level, but the rest of the world is, so they're just creating that framework and the market conditions that companies will have to adhere to it anyway. So that's a very good point. And so I want to talk a little bit about an area that has been obviously received a lot of attention, especially with the elections and in the last couple of years. So there are serious concerns about privacy and freedom of speech issues on tech platforms, right? On misinformation that has been spreading, and the companies, I think, have not found a good way to deal with it if we look at it. So how do you think we should go about regulating this, if at all, and what kind of authority or what kind of body should be in charge of that? To safeguard democracy, right?
Yeah, you don't have any easy questions, huh?
the difficult ones for the end, right? Friday afternoon.
So look, Section 230 was written in 1996, as I said before, when the internet was AOL and dial-up devices. It's very different today. It needs to be replaced, but the question is with what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
President Trump, in his onslaught against Section 230 and his request that the FCC come in and make decisions about what people say on various platforms, I think was playing the refs to try and make sure that social media gave him as much coverage as possible without limitation going into the election. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important question.
Yeah.
One of the issues here is we know that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
Okay? Your First Amendment right doesn't extend to that.
Yeah.
But we don't know what fire is in a crowded digital theater, and we have to work that out.
That's a really interesting analogy, and that's true. I think we don't have the answer to that.
And those are, and now we're back to judgment calls. Now we're back to how do you identify risks and manage them rather than how do you micromanage. So we're going to have policy decisions. We're going to have to make policy decisions. I haven't got any great 5-point plans for you here, but I do have an interesting thought that I've been playing with for some time. I wrote a piece in the New York Times about this a year or so ago. And that is that I don't think anybody wants to interfere with the First Amendment activity that happens in the algorithmic black box of a social media company.
Yeah.
But the difference between a social media company and the Washington Post, for instance,
right,
is that I pick up the Washington Post in the morning and I can see their editorial decisions right there in my hands.
Yeah, and you know who made those, right?
You know who
they
made
attributed, exactly.
I've got no idea about that, and worse, coming out of social media, and worse,
yeah,
I'm being fed something that the algorithm says I want to hear. You're being fed something the algorithm says you want to hear, and neither one of us know what or who. So my idea was this. You know, the reason for which Uber can use Google Maps to come find you and take you to your destination is because Google Maps has open APIs, application programming interfaces.
Yeah.
which is basically how two pieces of software work together. And hang on, you had a child, I have a phone. I'm just going to pick it up and hang it up. The joys of working at home, huh?
I know, right?
So an API is how two pieces of software work together. Why don't we have open APIs in social media so that you open the feed of data that goes into the algorithm, and you open the algorithm's decisions coming out? Exact same thing that happens on the front page of a newspaper. You know the information that's coming in from AP. You know the information that's going out to their subscribers. Open that up and allow people to this is a very persistent person here. Allow people to build their own algorithms that understand what's going on. So,
that's interesting, actually.
So you put something.
That would be a very different model.
Yeah, you put something on a news program on television or on a newspaper.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of groups, from the ACLU to Accuracy in Media, who are sitting there looking at that and making an assessment about it.
Yeah.
Right. And what has to happen is that we need to create the ability for third parties like that to take the same data and say, hey, you need to know that Facebook is taking this kind of information from this source and feeding it out to this kind of an audience, not who they are specifically.
Yeah.
And move from there.
That's really interesting.
And so I believe that there have to be ways that we can harness technology to address these problems as well.
Because I think, what people forget is to take that comparison again with the Washington Post, is that I see, as you said, you see the editorial decision, and people going to the Washington Post for the information, they get the news, they know it has been verified, it has been reviewed by the editorial board. When we go to Facebook and more people are getting their information, their news from Facebook, you don't have that, right? And this is just so ripe for misinformation, and it's really, I think, a very central problem to our democracy and democracies around the world, because it really undermines the major aspect, which is fact-based information that people can make a decision on.
The worst part, Sanjay, is it's done in secret.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Even Mark Zuckerberg doesn't know what's going on in the algorithm, and I wouldn't expect him to.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But there is an equation acting in secret that is determining the information you get.
Yeah.
And let's just open that up.
That's actually a really interesting idea.
I don't want to mess with the equation.
Right. But at least people can know what it is, right?
That's right.
And look behind it. That's actually a really interesting idea. And it wouldn't require government regulators to come in and make very micromanaged decisions about what to post, what the problem is, right?
That's right.
Wonderful. So I want to just, the last question that I have is going to one of your core accomplishments, right? When you were FCC chairman, which is you passed and established net neutrality. And you've been a vocal proponent of net neutrality, which was unfortunately repealed in 2017. And so I was wondering, have you seen any evidence of what the repeal has done to internet usage, to market concentration, and what do you see the future of that kind of approach?
Yeah. So great question, Sanjay, and I think let's back up and flip it just a little bit. One of the arguments that we heard was that you couldn't do this because it would discourage the companies from making the capital expenditures necessary to build out a high-speed broadband infrastructure. And so the comparison to look at, I believe, is what were the capital expenditures during the period in which net neutrality was in force, and the period from before when it wasn't. And the answer is they were higher, despite this awful, burdensome regulation.
Yeah.
The other issue is we talked about about the need to have some agility and some focus on how to respond. And we talked about how we used what we call the general conduct rule in the open internet action. One of the things that we had started and was canceled after we left was to look at so-called zero rating for wireless companies.
Okay, what is that?
So for instance, AT&T, as you know, owns Time Warner,
right,
HBO, as well as all the movie production. And they are now saying to their subscribers, hey, if you use our wireless service, we'll deliver HBO and all our other products to you without charging you data fees.
Okay.
But if you're a Comcast subscriber, or you want to get Netflix on us, over us, we're going to charge you for it.
Right.
And that struck me as contrary to the concept of open access to the network and anti-competitive at that.
Yeah, that's a good example, actually.
That is now a pretty well entrenched concept. But I think is something that is worthy of review. You know, it's really interesting, Sanjay. I'm a big history buff. I wrote a book on Abraham Lincoln's use of the telegraph during the Civil War.
Oh, interesting.
And the Pacific Telegraph Act of 1862, which paid for the telegraph to go to the West Coast, had in there a provision that said that access to the telegraph would be on a first come, first serve, non-discriminatory basis. Because they realized they were building a bottleneck.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So anybody can get on. When telephones came along, same concept was applied to telephones. We wouldn't have the internet today if we hadn't been able to take those screaming modems, hook them up to our telephone lines, and connect us to the internet. And the phone companies hated it.
Oh, really? They did? Okay.
Hated it.
Huh, interesting.
Why can't I make money off of that? And no, you're a common carrier. You got to allow everybody to get on. That's the concept that net neutrality is all about, which goes, as I say, goes back to 1862 and actually goes back to 13th century English common law, where, now we'll get into some fascinating historical that actually goes back to the bubonic plague.
Wow, how so? That's actually super interesting.
And so here was this, as you're coming out of feudalism, the issue became, would the feudal lord be able to control access to essential services such as the ferry across the river? Okay. And English common law developed saying, no, you have to provide first come, first serve, non-discriminatory access. And that was one of the key things that brought us out of feudalism, and it was in the time of the bubonic plague.
Wow.
And so here we are in another plague, and it's applicable again to the essential service of today, the most powerful and pervasive platform on the planet, the internet.
Especially now that all of us are working from home, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I would have never thought that there would be a connection between bubonic plague and net neutrality, but it's always good to learn.
There you go. Now you've got some. If we only were going to cocktail parties anymore, you would have cocktail conversation. But of course, we don't go to cocktail parties anymore either.
Definitely. Well, maybe a Zoom cocktail, right? Well, this was really interesting, and I thank you very much for your time.
Sanjay, was
and
great.
All the best to you and your family.
Take care. Thank you, sir.
Take care.